When my son declared, "Dad, you have no authority in this company anymore," I froze. Right there in the office I'd spent 50 years building with my own hands. I'm William Dalton, 70 years old, an investor, the founder of Dalton Legacy, a man who once placed every ounce of trust in David, my only son. But his greed and his lies pushed me into a fight to reclaim my own name. If you want to know how I turned everything around, hit subscribe, follow this story, and tell me where you're listening from in the comments. When David stood there, eyes wide, empty, like he couldn't even recognize the pain his words carved into me, a cold streak ran down my spine. I'd sat in that same chair decades ago, watched Dalton Legacy grow from tiny handshake deals into a $30 million real estate empire. Every brick, every project, every contract across 50 long years carried my fingerprints. And now my own son, the one I trusted without a shred of doubt, wiped it all away with a single sentence. I remember the day I handed everything over to him. A small ceremony in the main conference room. Just a few loyal employees. I gave him the office keys, my hand trembling, but my eyes steady. "David, you're the only one I trust. Dalton Legacy is yours now," I said. I smiled, but inside was a mix of hope and a little fear. I kept only the consulting agreement and a tiny office to sit in, figuring I'd rest, offer experience when needed. Never, not once, did I imagine my kindness would turn into a blade pressed straight into my own heart. 6 months later, the betrayal hit like a brutal storm. Under the influence of his new wife, a woman with cold eyes and a smile full of schemes, David cut off my entire pension. They changed the office locks and hung a sign, "Not for him." I walked up to that door, trying to stay calm, but my hands shook, my breath stuttered, and the anger boiling inside refused to stay quiet. "Dad, you have no authority here anymore," David said, confident, smug, dismissive. I stared at him, this grown man who used to be the child I carried in my arms, the boy I taught to look far ahead. And now he looked at me like I was some washed-up old man with nothing left to offer. In those first days, I just stood outside, watching the company I built being taken over piece by piece. Every time I walked past that office, something twisted inside my chest. I remembered every framed photo, every award on the shelf, now just silent witnesses to betrayal. I kept a journal writing down every project, every employee, every deal. Those notes weren't business. They were proof. Proof that I had never stopped being the true architect of it all. At night, when the house fell quiet, I'd sit by the window staring out at the Arizona desert, asking myself why trust could be crushed so mercilessly. I spent my whole life teaching David about honor, about leadership, about respecting people. But he forgot it all. There's a kind of pain sharper than any con from an outsider, the pain of being betrayed by your own blood. I kept wondering, did I trust too much? Or does power always twist people into wanting everything, even if it means tearing family apart? And the hurt didn't stop there. I watched David and his wife smear my name with old partners, whispering that I was too old and losing clarity to be involved in anything meaningful. Every phone call from someone who once believed in me felt like another clean, quiet knife slicing into my pride. I wrestled with anger, helplessness, and the fear that my reputation might vanish if I stayed silent. One afternoon in the tiny office they hadn't bothered to strip from me, I stood over the contracts I'd signed myself. And that's when I decided I wasn't bowing my head. I didn't care about reclaiming the company. Money wasn't the point anymore. I wanted recognition for the years, the strategy, the decisions that built Dalton Legacy from nothing. I dove into that consulting agreement. Every clause about intellectual property, every line tied to business plans I created. Each sentence was a legal weapon, quiet but deadly. And I realized, even retired, I still held enough proof to force David to back off. I listed every project I initiated, every development plan David thought he'd stolen clean. I told myself this wasn't about rage. It was about strategy. The kind forged from 50 years of hard lessons. Those plans, those documents, they could pull in millions. And I knew once I brought them to the table, David wouldn't hold the control he thought he did. Then something hit me. The most important truth of all. The pain, the betrayal, the public humiliation, they had all become fuel. I wasn't letting this end here. I would use the law, my mind, and the very plans I created to fight for my name, my dignity, my rights. No apology, no hush money. I wanted a victory that would revive everything David tried to erase. When I closed that notebook and looked out into the empty offices, I knew the real battle hadn't even begun. And out of all that pain, I found the path forward. An attack born from contracts, from ownership, from leverage. David never imagined I still held. In the days after I decided I wouldn't stay silent anymore, I started watching every move David and his wife made. Every meeting, every deal, every step they took was a reminder that I'd been pushed out of my own company. But instead of sinking into despair, something colder started burning inside me. A plan only a man who's lived long enough to taste both triumph and betrayal could put together. I didn't rush. I watched, I took notes, and I waited for the moment to strike. One morning when David strutted into the office in that shiny suit of his, wearing that smug smile he thought looked like confidence, I called my attorney. I wanted to read David's intentions through every line of every contract without letting a hint of anger slip out. I had to stay calm, steady, like an old lion crouched in the tall grass, waiting for the perfect opening. David couldn't suspect that I, not him, held the real cards. Inside, I wrestled with a bitter mix of rage and regret. How did the boy I raised, the boy I taught, turn around and treat me like some piece of useless furniture I started gathering? Every development plan I'd created during those 6 months of so-called retirement. Each one had the potential to make millions. I watched David brag to investors that every new project is under my leadership, but I knew the truth, those ideas, those strategies, they came from me. And I turned the intellectual property clauses in my consulting agreement into weapons. Every project, every deal, every projected profit could become evidence, undeniable, airtight evidence. The anger in me simmered, but alongside it came a sharp, dangerous satisfaction. This was my chance to set things right. One night, sitting alone in that tiny office, its yellow lamp casting long shadows over old files, I looked at a key land lease contract still under my personal name. I remembered those brutal negotiations, the patience it took to win that deal. Now it was the perfect hostage. One signature from me and David would lose control of every project tied to it. A thin smile crept across my face, not joy, but the feeling of strategy locking into place. The feeling of a betrayed man slipping back into the driver's seat. But the drama didn't end with documents and plans. I had to face David head-on. In a tense meeting, I calmly presented several new projects, plans I'd completed during my retirement. His eyes twitched, his breath quickened, his jaw dropped. He never expected I still owned the intellectual rights to all of it. "Dad, you can't do this," David stuttered, his voice cracking. I gave him a thin, icy smile, didn't say a word. Silence sometimes is the hardest lesson a man can learn. Inside, I was torn apart, rage on one side, sorrow on the other. I remembered the years I spent teaching him how to negotiate, how to think ahead, and now those lessons came back like a slap across his own face. The power he thought he held was nothing but an illusion. I had to stay patient. Emotion couldn't control me, not now. Every step, every sentence had one goal: force David to acknowledge the value I built. Then the drama deepened when his wife stepped in, trying to provoke him, feeding him venom, trying to turn him against me with cheap insults. I said nothing. I watched. I stored away every detail, every word. All they did was strengthen my resolve. If I wanted to win, I had to be subtle. Use the law on one side, psychological pressure on the other. I started writing letters to old partners, reminding them of my contributions while keeping my legal ammunition hidden inside the consulting agreement. This wasn't a fight over money. This was a war of intellect, a war of endurance. Then, on a blistering Arizona afternoon, when David proudly announced to the staff that every project is under my command, I sent my attorney a detailed list of projects, each one marked with notes showing the intellectual property belonged to me. I knew, the second this reached, David panic would set in. Every project on that list was a legal time bomb, and he'd have to choose surrender or lose everything he thought he controlled. In that moment, I felt something sharp, half resentment, half cold satisfaction. I had been betrayed, humiliated, shoved aside, but now I was turning that pain into a weapon. Every phone call, every contract, every plan was another step toward the climax I knew was coming. Court. That would be the battlefield where I took back my power. I closed my eyes, inhaled slowly, and told myself, David won't understand what he's lost until the judgment comes. And with every piece of evidence, every legal right, every painful memory fueling me, I prepared for the final strike. A place where justice would speak and where David would pay the price for his greed. The plans I kept weren't just proof of my worth. They were the very weapons that would strip him of the projects he thought he owned outright. I never imagined that patience and a lifetime of hard-earned experience would become the sharpest weapons I'd ever wield. When David received the list of projects and the intellectual property that belonged to me, he couldn't hide the panic. I saw his eyes twitch, saw him trying to keep that confident posture, and failing. His wife stood behind him, lips pressed, tight eyes burning with anger and fear. Neither of them ever expected that the old man they once dismissed now held the power to flip their entire world upside down. I called for a meeting in the old conference room, the place where the very first negotiations of Dalton Legacy had taken shape. I sat there quietly, a hot cup of coffee in my hand, staring straight at David. "You know what I kept, don't you, son?" I asked, my voice calm but cold as stone. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. He finally understood that every move he'd made was now under a harsh, unforgiving light. His wife tried to interrupt. "William, don't turn this into some kind of game." I gave her a dry, almost amused smile. A game, no. This was justice. And this time, justice was on my side. Over the next few weeks, I rolled out each development plan I'd crafted during my retirement. Every one of them had massive profit potential. David pushed back hard, scrambling for loopholes, trying to question the legality of my work. I stayed calm, every word I spoke, anchored in the consulting agreement, in intellectual property rights, in the mountain of evidence I'd prepared with care. Every time he raised his voice, I just shrugged and repeated, "It's all in the contract." I could feel his anxiety spreading, and inside me rose a cold, steady satisfaction. One day during a meeting with a major partner, David tried to shove me aside. "You're retired, Dad. You don't need to be part of this," he said. I kept my composure, looked straight at the partner and said, "Good thing I still own the intellectual rights to every new project. Before we continue, I think you should know that." Silence. The kind of silence where even the ticking of the clock feels loud. The partner looked at me, then at David, then back at me. I saw the shift from doubt to respect to caution. A quiet, cold satisfaction stirred in me. But I stayed steady. This was only the first act of a much longer fight. David tried to push back again, pointing to projects he thought he controlled. I answered gently, but with finality. What I created, what I structured, still belongs to me. You can use it if you agree to profit sharing. This time, his wife didn't dare step in. She could see their schemes unraveling, see the trap closing. I saw the chaos in their eyes, and in that moment I knew I'd cornered them. They couldn't escape the legal and intellectual leverage I carried. But the conflict wasn't just legal. It wasn't just business. Inside me, something twisted regret mixed with fury. Every time I looked at David, the son I raised, the boy I taught, the young man I sacrificed half my life for, I felt a deep, aching disappointment. How easily trust and family can be crushed under the weight of greed. I remembered family dinners afternoons, teaching him how to read contracts, and those memories stung more than any betrayal. I doubled down on strategy, on psychology, on the law. I contacted partners directly, reminding them of my role, my work, my ownership. Every call, every email was another weight pressing down on David's shoulders. I watched him crack his pride, shaken his ambition, turning into fear. And that's when I understood strategy isn't just about legal rights. It's about forcing your opponent to see the cage they built for themselves. One afternoon, Arizona sunlight cutting sharp through the window, I called David and said, "We need to settle profit distribution before this reaches court." His eyes were red, his smile strained, and the confidence he used to parade around was gone. I knew then the climax was coming. The courtroom was waiting, and I was ready. Anger, satisfaction, determination, they all flowed through me. I wasn't stopping. Not until my rights, my honor, and the legacy I built over 5 decades were recognized. When David sat there in silence, staring at the plans spread across the table, I saw it clearly: the final legal battle was near. Every preparation, every quiet maneuver, every ounce of pain and betrayal was about to pay off. And from this moment forward, I stepped into the peak of the story, where the courtroom would lay everything bare, and where the consulting agreement and my intellectual property would strike with a force he could no longer deny. The day of the hearing, I walked into that courtroom with slow, steady steps. My eyes swept across the familiar faces and the ones who'd made themselves my enemies. The room was silent, just the rustle of paper, the shallow breaths of attorneys circling their own fears. David stood on the other side, dressed sharp, trying hard to look composed, but his eyes gave him away. Fear, pure, trembling fear. I looked straight at him, and something cold rose in my chest, part fury, part grim satisfaction. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment every wound, every betrayal, every humiliation would finally come to light. When the judge entered, my heartbeat kicked up. I knew every clause, every document, every scrap of evidence I carried would determine how this ended. My attorney began calm, clear, relentless. He laid out the consulting agreement I kept, the intellectual property rights, the proof of David's attempts to take what he had no right to take. I watched David's face tighten, twitch, crumble, as project after project he thought he owned was proven beyond argument to belong to me. He stood, tried to fight back, but every time he opened his mouth, my attorney shut him down with legal facts sharp enough to cut through bone. And I felt something rise inside me, a strange rising thrill. Every time I'd been barred from my own office, every pension payment they stripped away, every public insult, was now fuel for this exact moment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lash out. I just watched, calm and composed, each breath soaked in determination. When the judge asked me directly about the evidence and the intellectual rights, I stood. My voice didn't shake. My tone was cold, firm, final. All new projects, including the development plans made during my retirement, are built on my experience, my intellect, my work. Those rights cannot be dismissed, no matter what my son believes. I stared at David as I said it, let him see the anger, the resolve, the depth of what he'd thrown away. His head dropped. He didn't dare speak. Fear had finally swallowed whatever pride he had left. As witness after witness confirmed my contributions over 50 years, I felt the weight of my reputation rise behind me like a tide. I remembered the early days of Dalton Legacy, the sleepless nights, the brutal negotiations, the grit it took to turn scraps into something real. Now all of it stood there beside me, proving my legacy couldn't be erased by greed. A cold, quiet satisfaction filled me, but beneath it, the old hurt still lingered. Betrayal has a long memory. When the ruling was finally announced, my heart pounded. The judge upheld the consulting agreement, recognized my intellectual property rights fully, ruled that David's actions, cutting my pension, banning me from the office, were serious violations of contract. I listened to every word, every sentence, hitting me like a wave, part anger, part relief, part long-awaited justice. David was forced to yield, and I was granted 51% of the profits from every project built on my intellectual work. My chest tightened, half triumph, half sorrow. Justice had returned. So had my dignity. David lowered his head, hesitated, tried to speak, but I didn't care to hear it. I stepped forward, placed my hand on the table, and said quietly, coldly, "You won the company, David, but you lost your father's trust, forever." No sentence could repair what he'd broken. But the message was clear: greed can't outrun reputation or wisdom. When I walked out of the courtroom, sunlight hit my face, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the deep breath of freedom, of victory. I'd reclaimed not only my economic rights, but the recognition for everything I built. As David and his wife followed behind me, I realized this battle had never just been about money. It was about honor, about legacy, about the resilience a lifetime carves into a man. They would live in the shadow of the father they tried to erase. But life doesn't stop at a legal victory. I knew I had another road ahead, a new chapter built on the rights and reputation I just restored. A second beginning. One where I lead, I decide, and Dalton Legacy returns to the course I always intended. I looked back at the empty offices, the contracts I had fought to protect, and I told myself, this isn't the end. This is the opening step of the final chapter, where reputation, intellect, and hard-won wisdom will finally speak for themselves. When the hearing finally ended, I didn't feel that explosive victory people like to imagine. Instead, there was this heavy silence inside me where anger, satisfaction, and an old dull ache blended into one slow-burning current. David stood there pale as paper, bitterness swimming in his eyes. His wife stayed quiet, knowing every scheme they'd plotted had just been flipped on its head. But I didn't linger on the pleasure of winning. I knew that 51% control over the profits was only one piece of the battle. The real victory would be what I built with that power. A few weeks later, I started moving. I didn't return to Dalton Legacy. I built a brand new real estate consulting firm. Projects I led myself, using the rights I'd just won back in court. Every contract, every project, carried my signature, my judgment, my experience. But this time I trusted no one blindly, not even my own son. Something in me had changed. Wisdom and age, they weren't just traits anymore. They were weapons. And I intended to use them to rebuild an empire on my own terms. Meanwhile, David and his wife had no choice but to pay out my share each year, exactly as the court ordered. I heard whispers, saw the numbers. They were struggling, juggling projects, negotiating with partners desperate not to violate my rights again. And in one strange, bitter moment, I realized something. The people who once dismissed my name, doubted my judgment, questioned my clarity after retirement, were now stuck living in the shadow I cast. I wasn't thrilled because of the money. I was satisfied because justice had finally spoken, because greed could not outrun intellect or reputation. Then came an unexpected twist. Old partners, the ones who doubted me, even mocked me, started reaching out, offering new deals, wanting to work with me directly. They didn't see me as just the old founder anymore. They saw me as something more, a symbol of credibility, wisdom, and grit earned the hard way. That's when it hit me: a man's true legacy isn't a company or a fortune. It's the respect he earns over a lifetime. Respect no one can steal. One quiet afternoon in Arizona, I sat in my new office looking out at the open desert. I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the humiliation, the shock of being pushed out by my own son. And somehow, from all that pain, I had found strength and patience and experience and courage. I let out a small smile. Steady, cold. I hadn't just won back my rights. I'd built a new chapter, one where I controlled every direction, every move, every consequence. But the emotions still lingered. Every time I thought of David, there was a mix of sorrow and fury. Sorrow, that ambition had turned him into a man willing to betray his own father. Fury, that he believed money could replace trust and honor. I knew our relationship would never return to what it once was. Some wounds don't close. Some bridges burn for good. But I also understood something deeper. Some victories are larger than wealth. They come from reclaiming your worth, your dignity, your name. Then came the final twist. A few projects I had once left in David's hands started proving his actual talent. He tried to salvage what he could, tried to grow from what remained. I watched it all with a strange mix of emotions, part satisfaction, part quiet acknowledgement. Even those who betray you eventually learn the limits of greed. Sometimes that's the only way they learn. One evening I stood on the balcony of my new office, looking down over the busy Arizona streets. I felt the breath of a second success, a second life. Dalton Legacy still existed, but I had created something new, something powerful, something unmistakably mine. The projects I controlled, the contracts I led, they weren't just sources of income. They were symbols of wisdom, earned credibility, proven dignity, reclaimed. And in my heart, one truth was carved in stone: the greatest legacy a man leaves behind isn't property or wealth. It's intellect, experience, honor, things time can't dim and greed can't erase. The story closes here, but the echo remains: David and his wife, living beneath the shadow they once tried to destroy. And me, an old father, long betrayed, writing the final chapter of his life with justice, dignity, and hard-won wisdom at the helm. Thank you for listening to my story, a journey from broken trust to the triumph of intellect and honor. If you want more shocking family dramas, more strategy, more emotion pulled straight from impossible situations, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support is what keeps these stories alive.